Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Consumer prices in the United States increased more than expected in March, leaving a question mark from the Federal Reserve on cutting interest rates.
Our other headlines, all this green energy but nowhere to store it. China's battery capacity is running low.
Israel says it's agreed the return of Palestinians to the north of Gaza as part of ceasefire talks being held in Egypt.
And it's taken 10 years of wrangling, but the European Union has finally agreed on an EU-wide immigration policy. Will it work? Inflation in the United States is proving rather more stubborn than hoped. Prices were up 3.5% in the 12 months to March, more than expected.
It's raised fears that the fight against inflation may be stalling and sent stocks on Wall Street lower. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, who's at the New York Stock Exchange. So, John, inflation getting hotter again?
Yes. Robin, Jamie, welcome to Inflation Day here in America. Everyone is talking about this, and the stocks are reacting negatively, as you might imagine that they are. It came in hotter than expected, elevated yet again, and the thing is, this is the third month in a row that this has happened when it comes to CPI, which, by the way, in case you don't know, is the inflation paid by Americans in the stores and the gas stations. So let me run through what the headline and the core were. So first of all, the headline rate, month over month, came in at elevated by 0.4%, not 0.3%, which the economists had told us to expect. Year on year, 3.5%, not 3.4%, which the economists had told us to expect. And the core, which I think is the most significant of them, really, where you strip out the volatile food and energy. So let's strip them out and throw them to the side. And you get core inflation at 3.8%, not 3.7%, you see. So it's all more than we'd been told to expect. And we know that this keeps happening here. So where is the inflation? Well, it seems to be, as far as I can tell, pretty much everywhere, stubbornly stuck there at the moment, but particularly in things like shelter. Gasoline prices, I think, account for this. And how about this? Auto insurance is up 22% in a year. Now, is auto insurance something that you have to have? It's vital for you. Well, it is, isn't it, for most? You can't drive a car without auto insurance. So this is all part of what's going on here. Now, we did know that the final part of the battle against inflation was always going to be the hardest, and so it is proving to be. And I think probably most people on Wall Street now feel that this rules out a June interest rate cut. So that's probably gone. So now we're looking at July, maybe September, who knows really. But certainly we're down to 2 only in 2024 now. Markets here pricing in just 2 interest rate cuts before the election, before the year's end. I think it's also worth pointing out that that doesn't mean that they can't cut in 2025. They can if they want to. So it's not a great problem really, but it's a sort of academic theory. It's quite interesting. Anyway, the point is, never mind academic theories, what did it do to your pensions? Well, total wipeout, basically, when this news came in at 8:30 this morning. Futures sharply down, and now we have the Dow down 500 points, which is pretty much where it's been all day. S&P 500 down by 60 points. I haven't seen the Nasdaq, but I'm sure that that is down as well. Basically, think of it like this: yields rising, stocks down. So the 2 and the 10-year are elevated. Gold is lower, of course. Oil, Brent over there in the North Sea, $89 a barrel. Bitcoin, I can't see. Sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't. I can't see it right now. So basically, we're waiting now for the next bit of inflation data. You see, the fun never ends here on Wall Street, because later this week we get PCE, personal consumption and expenditure, which the Federal Reserve prefers as a measure of inflation. And I will tell you this, PCE is about 1% lower than CPI. CPI is slightly less important these days in everyone's eyes than PCE. So we'll see what PCE is when it comes out towards the end of the week, which is the beginning of first quarter earnings season, by the way.
Well, John, let's step away from Wall Street for a moment and go to Washington, where President Biden's been meeting the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, but at a rather awkward time for US-Japanese relations.
It is a bit, I'm afraid to say, yes. Now, as you know, Japan is a major U.S. ally, but there's a problem in the steel industry, which is rather overshadowing this visit. Within the last hour, President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida met on the south lawn of the White House. They both gave speeches. They've now gone up and they are talking in the White House, and there'll be a news conference a bit later on. The problem is that Nippon Steel of Tokyo has a $15 billion plan on the table to take over U.S. Steel of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, and nobody seems happy about this. Nobody. The unions don't want it. They want to be taken over by an American company, not a Japanese one. Biden doesn't want it because he wants the union vote in the November election. He's the most pro-union president, he says, that there's ever been. I think he's probably right. Local politicians don't want it, particularly if they're in marginal seats, and even President Trump doesn't want it, and he says he'll reverse it if he wins the election in November, which he may very well do, because I don't think they're going to have this sorted out by November. I have to say, the problem is that this is a deal between two private companies, Nippon and U.S. Steel. They've done the deal. The regulators will almost certainly get involved now, and it slightly smacks of anti-foreign ism, doesn't it, don't you think? Because America wants to have inward investment from overseas countries, including Japan, and this slightly smacks of, well, we want to be taken over, but we don't want those Johnny foreigners to do it. And this is a problem, I think, going forward, potentially for President Biden. Now, the White House says they're not talking about this in these talks, simply not talking about it at all. But the problem is the reporters will. When they have the news conference, the reporters will raise it, which is why it's a little bit awkward at this time. It's you know, politics dominating business. That's what's going on.
So they're not talking about this steel deal. So what are they talking about?
China. You knew that was coming, didn't you? I'm afraid China topping the agenda, we think, for all sorts of reasons. Not in an aggressive way, particularly. I mean, you have to remember, Japan is part of the Quad, which is a group of countries based sort of around the Indo-Pacific region, which is there to promote Indo-Pacific interests. That's America and Australia, Japan and India. And so they're talking about China in such a way that they want to compete with China. They want to essentially match what China is doing in that region. Now, the White House says there are 70 deliverables, which is a horrible word for things that might actually be positive from this meeting. 70 deliverables, which are quite a lot. So they're talking about defense and space and artificial intelligence, but apparently not steel, as we've already said. And so there will be a black tie dinner later this evening. It's not a state dinner. A state dinner is something a bit different. It doesn't mean much to you and me, but it means an awful lot to the White House staff and to the Washington, D.C. people. A black tie dinner this evening for the Prime Minister. And the entertainment this evening, just if you're interested, will be New York's own Paul Simon. He of Simon & Garfunkel. Now, he's in his 80s now, but he's providing the entertainment after all the business of the day is done in Washington, D.C. And hopefully, Robin, he could build a bridge over troubled water. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
The rating agency Fitch has raised concern over China's rising levels of government debt and uncertain economic prospects, leading to it to downgrade the country's sovereign credit rating to negative. The finance ministry in Japan called the decision regrettable. Well, let's talk to the financial correspondent Timothy Pope in Shanghai. Timothy, how bad is this?
Well, what Fitch is saying here is that this is kind of due to predicted rises in the Chinese government debt levels for both the central government and many local and provincial governments around the country. It's also worth noting that this downgrade does bring Fitch into line with the other two major international ratings agencies, Moody's and S&P. But it doesn't mean that China is headed for a downgrade. It's actually also not quite clear why Fitch chose this moment, because the latest economic data has been more encouraging. We saw better than expected results for retail sales, exports, CPI and factory output in January and February, and the March data isn't out yet. The Chinese finance ministry said today in a statement that China's forecast deficit ratio for this year, which is 3%, is a moderate one, given the government's efforts to turn the country into a high-tech manufacturing powerhouse and support economic growth and also to promote domestic demand. It also highlighted the work done in recent years by all levels of the Chinese government to crack down on financial risk. That really has been a big theme of a lot of the government's recent policies. So you get the feeling that the Chinese finance ministry thinks that this downgrade is a little unfair.
How are the markets expected to react?
Well, so far, this announcement was out during trade for the Chinese mainland markets on Wednesday, and they largely seemed to ignore the move. There was a bit of a dip on the markets, but investors seem to have other things on their minds. The downgrade by Moody's in December we saw previously when they downgraded China's debt caused a bit more of a stir. But the market this week has its eyes on other things, sales numbers at China's big property developers, and a whole batch of economic data that's due for release this week. That includes the first quarter GDP numbers. So in the scheme of things, the Fitch decision didn't really seem to figure today.
Ratings agencies are a bit like weather forecasts, aren't they? I mean, they don't always get things right. As you say, Fitch came under fire when it downgraded US debt last year. I think Yale University and JP Morgan and Warren Buffett all put the boot into Fitch. I mean, does anyone really take Fitch seriously?
Well, yes, nobody's right all the time. And it is true that Fitch's US debt downgrade last year was around really did agree with that one. It was decried as a bit of a political move, and its timing was questioned as well. Whether ratings agencies are really useful, people do pay attention to them. But the downgrade of China's debt today has also raised a few eyebrows. Timing is an issue again. As I mentioned earlier, it's come out before the important first quarter data, which you think would be critical in informing a ratings decision. It's also come out ahead of a regular meeting of China's leaders in the Politburo this month. The April meeting of that body is also one which usually focuses on the economy too. So another thing you'd expect to inform a rates decision. Another thing that we've seen is a lot of analysts commenting on this. Some are saying that it's using lagging indicators, so not really a judgment on China's future creditworthiness, but more of a look at what's been happening in the last couple of years. So again, not particularly useful. And there have been other strategists and economists saying things along the lines of, yes, the economy has been going through a bit of a rough patch in China, but the risks that Fitch is pointing to are manageable, and the ratings agency's concerns are perhaps unjustified.
Timothy, thank you for that. The financial correspondent Timothy Pope in Shanghai, and apologies for the sound quality, usual interweb mysteries.
China's Commerce Minister Wang Wentao is in Italy on the next leg of his European visit. He's expected to meet the country's foreign minister and business leaders. Let's talk to our correspondent Alex Fraser in Milan. So, Alex, Wang Wentao in Italy for a few days. What's he hoping to achieve?
Well, I think first and foremost, he wants to show that China is open to business and to European investment, and particularly Italian investment. Today, behind me at the Hotel dei Cavalieri in the centre of Milan, they had an Invest in China event with business leaders from across Italy and China, sponsored by the Commerce Ministry in China. And that was all about showing this cooperation and starting to work together on stuff and to try and attract European investment in China. And that's here in the economic powerhouse of Milan. And tomorrow Wentao will go to the other economic powerhouse in Italy, and that's the region of Veneto. And he's going to be visiting a bilateral business and dialogue forum in Veneto, in Verona, sorry. And then he will be going to Venice for an event celebrating the life of Marco Polo at the University in Venice, and particularly Italy and Chinese relations. Now, this visit comes at a time when you had Tajani, the Italian foreign minister, Antonio Tajani, visited China back in September, and Wentao then said that he would welcome more Italian investment. And at the moment, Italy's relations with China under the Meloni government had begun to change from previous administrations. Italy declined to renew the Belt and Road Agreement in December with China, but the two countries still have a lot of annual trade between them. In 2023, for example, that was at nearly $80 billion. And in the past, there's been a lot of Chinese investment in Italy, particularly in this city, Milan, and across the north of Italy in all sorts of industries. And I think this visit will hope that Italian investment will make its way to China too. So it's clear that this trip is all about wanting to continue good relations between the two countries, despite Italy not being involved in Belt and Road, and for economic cooperation in the future, and of course, cultural partnerships too.
Alex Fraser in Milan, thank you very much.
The semiconductor giant TSMC has posted more than $6 billion for its March revenue. That's an increase of more than 34% year-on-year. The company is cashing in on a continuing boom in artificial intelligence powered by high-end chips. It's the fastest growth that the chip maker has seen in nearly 2 years.
Shares in another chip-making giant, Nvidia, are down 10% from their most recent all-time high. The drop in value is thought to be partly due to the introduction of a new AI chip by rival company Intel. Nvidia has performed strongly over the past year with high demand for its products, thanks to the popularity of generative AI models.
The co-founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma, has written a memo to staff breaking months of silence. On an internal company forum, Ma pledged his support to management at the internet giant, saying he had seen the birth of a strong and brave team and admitting mistakes had been made in the past. Alibaba's shares increased, having fallen by a quarter over the last 12 months.
The hit online role-playing game World of Warcraft is set to return to China after a dispute between companies was resolved. The game went offline last year when Chinese giant NetEase failed to reach a new licensing agreement with the US-based creator Activision Blizzard. But they've struck a new deal which will see the game and other popular titles return to China later this year.
Beijing has expressed concern over an EU investigation into Chinese wind turbine suppliers, describing the measure as discriminatory. It's the EU's latest move to try to shield domestic companies from what it sees as unfair competition from Chinese imports.
I think the outside world is worried about the rising tendency of protectionism in the EU. China's highly concerned about the discriminatory measures taken by the European side against Chinese businesses and industries. The development of China's energy-related industries embodies multiple advantages, such as technology, the market and the supply chain. And the export of related products has made an important contribution to the global response to inflation and climate change.
Well, as China's transition to green energy accelerates, a potential hurdle is emerging: storage. An industry association has warned that growth in China's battery storage capacity could slow down in 2024. An estimated 31 gigawatts of new capacity will come online this year. That's a 12% decrease on the previous year and 25% below an ideal scenario. The new storage lags behind global benchmarks, raising concerns among experts. Let's talk to Gaurav Sharma, who's an independent energy analyst. Good to see you on the programme. Welcome. So this report suggesting that China's battery storage growth will slow this year. Why?
I think you good to be back at the programme. I think the key thing to note here, first off, is that it is declining from a pretty high base. Now, there's several constraints here. It's a high interest rate climate. The way the energy transition is panning out, it needs to be reassessed. There are also other complications that involve sort of aligning China's grid with the direction of travel here. But what needs to be noted here is that it is declining from a low base. So if you're talking a cumulative growth of about 15 to 20% or thereabouts, it is not too bad. It's just that the sterling performance that we have seen in the last 2 to 3 years is not going to be replicated this year.
So this report suggesting this year's growth will be 25% below an ideal scenario. Experts said to be concerned about this. Are they right to be?
Partially, but not totally. I think what you look at it is the direction of travel for the energy transition between here and 2030, not just for China, but for the wider world. Now, if you're talking in terms of cumulative growth, much of this is going to come from Asia Pacific, 47% in fact, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And bulk of that 47% growth that we will see in the next 6 years will come from China. So there will be ups and downs, swings and roundabouts, but I think China is on the right track. The question is the amount of money that needs to be poured in. So if you look at it holistically, if you take renewables to be at a very conservative base, a $1 trillion opportunity, a fifth of that needs to be invested in battery storage, in grid-scale lithium-ion battery storage. And I think the Chinese are leading that count in Asia. And I think if you take region-wise, Asia-Pacific is streets ahead of the Europeans, who are in fact streets ahead of the Americans. So you look at it on a sliding scale, APAC, led by China, is still streets ahead.
So how important is this kind of energy storage? How does it actually work? Why is it needed?
That's a great question. You see, a lot of people talk about the energy transition. We talk about the proliferation of solar, of wind, of Asia, of Europe, of North America, heading down the energy transition track via renewables projects. But to sustain them, we need a resilient grid-scale lithium-ion battery storage, which can just keep the lights on if renewables energy is what our power mix is predicated on. That's why it's so essential. So when we talk about $1 trillion opportunity, at least a fifth of it must be allocated towards battery storage.
Gaurav Sharma, the independent energy analyst, great to talk to you today. Thank you for joining us on the programme.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead. Can anyone lend us a plane? Why airlines across the world are struggling to meet demand.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us.
And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. The World Trade Organization says global goods trade should rebound this year, but more slowly than previously expected. That's after only its third decline in 30 years in 2023.
The trade body said easing inflationary pressures should help volumes increase by 2.6% in 2024. But it warns of risks from trade fragmentation due to geopolitical tensions, rising protectionism and a worsening crisis in the Middle East. Juliet Mann spoke to WTO chief economist Ralph Osser.
To explain what's driving the pickup, let me first explain what drove the downturn in 2023, which is inflation. We've had very high energy prices. We've had a high price level anyways, which led firms and also consumers to delay some of their purchase decisions, and particularly the purchase decisions of traded goods. Think of capital goods, think of durable goods, things like a fridge, things like a car. If prices are high and if also interest rates are high, you tend to delay your consumption choices. And that's what happened in 2023. And now that inflation is coming down, now that interest rates are coming down, we are also seeing a pickup again of international trade in 2024 and also 2025.
And region to region, it's a different picture, isn't it? Africa's showing the fastest growth. Why is that?
Well, yes, I would say overall it's actually a pretty broad-based recovery. In particular, if we kind of fast forward to 2025, it's pretty broad-based. It's true that if you look at the 2024 numbers, Africa really stands out, but you have to remember it's a growth rate, and the growth rate is always calculated relative to a base. So in some sense, it's really the weakness in 2023 for that particular region that is now showing this high growth rate. Overall, it's really a pretty balanced picture where we see Asia being strong, I would say, perhaps in particular in 2024, but also Europe, at least no longer being a drag on trade growth as it was in 2023.
You've talked a little bit about inflation, about high energy prices. Where would you say the pressure points are going to come from? What could get in the way of the global trade recovery continuing on this trajectory?
Well, I think inflation is certainly still on our minds. We have to make sure that it continues to ease, and the central banks have to make sure that they, manage their monetary policy, of course, in a responsible fashion. There's both an upside risk and a downside risk, if you will. It could also be that inflation is coming down faster than we have expected. But, beyond inflation, geopolitical tensions are, of course, on our radar. And the potential fragmentation of international trade that they could result in.
And in terms of where we can go from here, you threw forward to 2026 at one point, but what can we expect in the year ahead?
We can expect, so if you look at 2024, so the current year, what we expect is so the volume of merchandise growth, the volume of merchandise trade to grow by 2.6%. If we look at next year, 2025, we expect the volume of merchandise trade to grow by 3.3%. So pretty robust growth. What we haven't talked about at all, and I also want to mention, is that services trade growth actually was already very strong in 2023, 9% year on year, and we also expect that this trend continues.
Hopes are dwindling of finding survivors after an explosion at a hydroelectric power plant in Italy. At least 3 people were killed and several others are missing after the incident on Lake Siviana. Authorities say the blast happened underwater during maintenance work 30 meters below the lake's surface. Flooding in Russia and Kazakhstan continues to worsen after Europe's 3rd longest river burst its banks. More than 100,000 people fled their homes after the Ural River, which flows into the Caspian Sea, flooded communities. The extra water comes from snowmelt running into rivers. The Kremlin said water levels are likely to rise. US airline Delta has posted its highest first quarter revenue after a surge in bookings. The carrier made $37 million in the first 3 months of the year after a loss of $363 million in the same period a year ago. Delta shares jumped 5% in pre-market trading, with the airline's CEO bullish about the outlook heading into summer.
The global airline industry is facing a summer squeeze, with travel demand expected to pass pre-pandemic levels while aircraft deliveries decline. Airlines are spending billions on repairs to keep flying older, less fuel-efficient aircraft. At the same time, the number of passengers expected to travel this year is set to reach record levels, hitting 4.7 billion people. Around the world, airlines will receive 19% fewer aircraft deliveries in 2024 because of production problems at Boeing and Airbus. And it's worse in the United States, where carriers there will receive 32% fewer jet deliveries than planned. That's because several airlines depend on Boeing's 737 MAX planes. Boeing's production was curtailed, of course, after that mid-air panel blowout on an Alaska air flight in January. Well, some carriers are being forced to cut their schedules to try to cope with the shortage of aircraft. In Europe, the low-cost airline Ryanair has cut some routes, and the overall shortage of new planes means the leasing market is booming. US analysts say airlines are spending around 30% more than usual to try to rent aircraft. Well, let's talk now to John Strickland, the independent aviation business strategist. John, to what extent do you think these production problems at Boeing and Airbus are going to put the global airline industry under pressure this summer?
They are going to put a significant brake on growth. We're talking about a period of very buoyant demand. We had a good year last year. IATA was projecting continued growth this year. That's the airline industry global trade body. But of course, if aircraft are not available as planned, examples such as the one you gave with Ryanair in Europe, they're expecting about 20 fewer aircraft than they had planned due to Boeing delivery delays on the 737 MAX. We have another European carrier, Wizz Air, which is suffering from a different problem. There are some engine challenges with Pratt & Whitney engines powering a number of Airbus A320 aircraft. Wizz has had to ground so far about a quarter of its fleet. That means no growth of that airline this year when originally it had planned double-digit expansion. And in the US, we just heard it in your news headlines there about Delta's strong performance. United, another of the large US carriers, has had to cut back its planned production increases this year. They've even asked pilots to go on unpaid leave next month because aircraft are simply not coming through. So it's all very well. If we look at it from a point of view of pricing, you could say, yeah, airlines can put their prices up and we will see fares going up, but they're missing out on a very strong and buoyant market, which, to be honest, they'd much rather be able to resource with their planned capacity growth.
Boeing says it's delivered, I think, just 83 aircraft to customers in the first quarter of this year. I think that's the smallest number since 2021. I mean, these safety investigations are ongoing, of course. I mean, they're not over. How much worse might this get?
Well, it's certainly going to be compounded. We've had one or two other issues concerning Boeing breaking to the media this week, not all to do directly with this issue with the 737 MAX, but the fact that the US regulator, the FAA, is really looking closely at Boeing, and indeed Boeing at the moment has to respond about what actions it's taking to address the issues of quality control in its production, particularly the 737 MAX. The fact they are being handicapped in their production levels, the fact that sub-suppliers, not only to Boeing but to Airbus themselves, are short of manpower. Spare parts are not readily available. We've even seen an example of a couple of 10-year-old Boeing 787 aircraft, very young aircraft, being broken up for spares because actually that makes more sense in terms of the lease companies who own them offering supplies of spares in a very tight market. So it's going to continue, certainly I think the rest of this year, and the northern hemisphere summer period will be constrained.
To those of us fantasizing about a summer holiday getaway, what does all this mean for passengers?
Not all the flights that were originally planned to operate will do so. Ryanair had already put on sale flights on a number of destinations, as, for example, had Wizz Air. Some of those have now had to be cut back, quite a bit of pruning, which is the last thing you want to do in the peak season. Given that people book quite early, certainly, again, if we look at European markets for summer travel or the US markets, the cheap seats will, in many cases, have gone. Those that remain, if they remain, will be much higher prices. So increased costs for travellers are to be expected this summer holiday period.
John, good to see you. Thanks so much for coming on the programme again. John Strickland, the independent aviation business strategist.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. In his strongest criticism yet of Israel, US President Joe Biden calls for a ceasefire to allow the delivery of food and medicine to Gaza.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Consumer prices in the United States increased more than expected in March, leaving another question mark over when the Federal Reserve will start cutting interest rates.
Our other headlines, concerns grow that China's battery storage capacity is running low and will not meet needs in the future. Israel has agreed to the return of some Palestinians to northern Gaza as part of ongoing ceasefire talks in Egypt. Israel says it would allow 150,000 Palestinians back to the north with no security checks. In return, Hamas would be expected to provide a list of female, elderly and sick hostages it's still holding who are alive. Talks to try to end over 6 months of conflict have faltered because the parties couldn't reach an agreement.
This comes as Israel faces a deadline to show the Supreme Court evidence that it's adopting measures to increase aid into Gaza. International pressure on Israel to allow more humanitarian supplies in has increased as the extent of famine conditions has become clearer. US President Joe Biden has delivered his strongest criticism yet, saying he disagrees with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's approach to the conflict.
I think what he's doing is a mistake. I don't agree with his approach. I think it's outrageous that those three vehicles were hit by drones and taken out on a highway where it wasn't like it was along the shore. It wasn't like there was a convoy moving there, etc. So what I'm calling for is for the Israelis to just call for a ceasefire, allow for the next 6-8 weeks total access to all food and medicine going into the country.
Let's talk to our correspondent Alex Cadier in Tel Aviv. Alex, strong words from President Biden. The beginnings of a potential truce deal. What more do we know?
Well, Jamie, I think the ceasefire negotiations may have just gotten a little bit more complicated. News breaking in the last hour or so that the 3 sons and 3 grandchildren of Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, have been killed in an Israeli drone strike in northern Gaza. Now, senior Israeli officials saying that the 3 sons of Ismail Haniyeh were involved in the military wing of Hamas, and that's why they were targeted. And the leader of Hamas, the political leader of Hamas, saying that he wants to make it clear that he welcomes the opportunity for his sons to reach martyrdom, and saying that if the enemy, in this case Israel, thinks that this will change Hamas's position in the negotiations, they are delusional. So we'll have to see exactly how that changes. We know that Hamas has been holding firm on its positions already for the last couple of days in these negotiations. They want to see an end to the war included in these talks, perhaps a pathway to the end of the war. They also say that they cannot release 40 vulnerable hostages. Vulnerable means either women, elderly or injured, because they don't have 40 still alive, and they don't want to hit that 40 number by releasing men or soldiers as well. So clearly those negotiations, you had signs of hope perhaps yesterday. Now it's looking more difficult. Tomorrow it may change. Very much an ongoing process, Jamie.
And has Israel reacted to that criticism from President Biden?
Well, Israel's been reacting for the last few days to pressure from the United States, and that statement by President Biden, quite interesting, saying that the way the war in Gaza has been conducted is a mistake, and also it seemed like calling for a unilateral ceasefire and Israel just ceasing fire immediately. Now that seems to be a very hard sell for the Israeli government, because we know while Prime Minister Netanyahu is under enormous international pressure to reach a ceasefire deal, to allow more aid to flow into Gaza, on which the UN says the bare minimum is being done now, but still a lot more to do, Benjamin Netanyahu is also under a lot of pressure politically, domestically here in Israel from his right flank, the far-right ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the National Security Minister, the Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, both saying that they would challenge Prime Minister Netanyahu's mandate to lead should the operation in Rafah not go ahead, or should a ceasefire deal that they see as being too lenient or too generous be agreed. So there is international pressure to reach a deal and to allow more aid to flow in. There's also domestic pressure to stop both those things.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Tel Aviv.
Tens of thousands of people are marking Eid al-Fitr in displaced camps in Gaza. The Palestinian Health Authority says more than 120 people have been killed in the past 24 hours in Israeli airstrikes. Many marked this year's Eid visiting loved ones in graveyards. The holiday marks the end of the fasting month of Ramadan. Our correspondent Akram Al-Satari is in Rafah.
Well, as a matter of fact, I have just come back from Khan Yunis city, and I could see what the Eid is like for the people who returned to Khan Yunis. They spent the whole day trying to find their dears who are under the rubble. They spent the whole day trying to find some of their luggage that was wasted because of the bombardment that left almost no house standing. I was walking in a very big area. Houses were destroyed. People were trying to find whatever that is left under the wrecks and ruins for their homes. People were walking for such a very long distance in the hope that they can get something. The Eid that is supposed to be a time for the celebration of life and for the joy, for the completion of the rituals according to Islam, is now being spent by the people trying to retrieve normalcy to their life, trying to find their dears who are under the rubble, and trying to secure their homes that are still standing, but they need a great deal of work and repairs for the sake of accommodating them once again. The Eid that was supposed to be a very joyful opportunity is a time for sorrow and mourning for most of the Palestinians in Gaza Strip. People of Gaza have been following anxiously the news about the negotiations that are taking place. They see and the Israeli demand to keep them in the Gaza South till otherwise decided, according to a thorough negotiation that has been taking place, as a mockery of their right to return to their homes, as a mockery of their right to a shelter, as a mockery of their right to live a decent life that is harm-free. Palestinians in Gaza who are staying now in the southern part of Gaza, but originally from the north of Gaza, have been saying, and many of them that I talked to have been saying, that this is a genuine right for them to come back to their homes, and that even when they are allowed to come back to their homes, they will see homes that are totally destroyed because of the ongoing bombardment. However, they want to come back, they want to return to those homes, and they want to stay just next to the wrecks of their homes and enjoy again a life that is not up to any standard life anywhere in the world. However, people are still waiting for a time when they will be able to return, but they are very skeptical about the intentions, about the offers, and about the statements that are made by the Israeli government. And they understand, given their long-standing experience for the last 6 months and for the last 17 months of blockade, and since 1948 and 1967, that the statements that are made by the Israeli officials not to be taken seriously, and that Israel is always up to something devastating when it comes to the Palestinians and the way their life is run, and their shelters and homes and streets and everything that has to do with their life.
It's taken 10 years of wrangling, but a highly controversial migration deal has been approved by European lawmakers. Our correspondent Trent Murray is in Brussels. So, Trent, what exactly has been agreed?
Well, Robin, this is a really big deal in Brussels because this is probably the biggest overhaul of how the EU handles
asylum seeker claims that we have seen in many, many years. And really that vote in the European Parliament in the past hour or so was very difficult to predict exactly how the cards would fall. But seemingly those lawmakers who have been pushing to get this over the line have scored a victory today. This is a wide-sweeping reform. Some of the main elements include a new process for how to handle asylum seekers when they arrive at an EU border. We know that under these new laws they will be photographed, there'll be health and security checks done, as well as fingerprints taken within 7 days of their arrival under this new mandate. And then that information will be used for authorities to make what they say is quite a quick determination of what to do next with that asylum seeker. Do they receive the regular asylum seeker application process? Do they have it accelerated? Or in some cases, are they returned to their country of origin? Now, this law also looks at some of those claims that come from countries that are generally rejected, nationalities which are rejected in high numbers, including Bangladesh, Morocco, Tunisia. What will happen there is those people will be placed in what's been described as detention centres near the EU's external borders. Lawmakers say that that is to try and help speed up the amount of deportations that are taking place. But it is the most controversial element of all of this. Many NGOs have been warning that that particular element of it undermines human rights, could encourage systemic determination. And we actually saw today in the chamber of the European Parliament some activists break in and disrupt proceedings. Let's have a listen to what took place.
We are in the middle of a voting session. This Parliament and its members need to be able to vote.
Now, those particular facilities are thought to be able to house around 30,000 people at any one time. The EU says annually they'll hold around 120,000. Again, this is all about, in the view of lawmakers, trying to speed up deportations for people that are not eligible for asylum. The second major element I need to mention is the kind of burden sharing, if you will, of how to handle vast numbers of asylum seekers. Right now, for countries like Malta and Italy, they really feel like they are at the front line of handling the large volumes of people, given the first country principle, where if someone arrives at a border country of the EU, it's up to that border country to handle the asylum case. Even if the person wants to travel, say, further north to places like Germany, well, under these new rules, there will be more cooperation between countries. Other countries that are not on the border will be asked to step up and assist more. It could be financial, it could be with personnel, or it could be handling the asylum seeker case themselves in country.
So, Trent, this deal has now finally been approved. So what happens next?
Well, what happens next is effectively the final rubber stamping of these set of reforms. We understand that will take place at a special EU Council meeting of Interior Ministers on April 29. That date could change, but I suspect it won't, given they'll want to try and get these laws on the books as fast as possible. From there, if it is rubber stamped at that EU Council meeting, it will be brought into force by 2026. And that timeline is quite crucial, because we need to remember there are EU elections coming up in June. And for many mainstream parties here in Brussels, they are witnessing in the polls a surge of support from far-right anti-immigrant parties. I'm thinking National Front, for example, National Rally, rather, Marine Le Pen's party in France, Alternative for Deutschland, AfD in Germany. Well, for many of those mainstream centrist parties, they will be hoping that today's vote will somewhat blunt that prickly issue of immigration and may be able to help them save some of those seats from those parties to their right when that crucial EU vote takes place in June.
Trent Murray in Brussels, thank you very much.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead.
Can a coral reef be brought back from the brink? Join us here in the south of Spain to find out.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Coral reefs are indicators of ocean health, and experts are concerned that in 2024, global warming could cause losses on a scale never seen before.
Experts meeting in Spain are now calling for a new round of global action. Our correspondent Ken Brown reports.
Arguably the most beautiful and biologically diverse places on our planet. But coral reefs are in grave danger from fishing, extreme heating and pollution. Here in the south of Spain, Coral Sol is part of a movement to save them.
Coral Sol es una ONG.
Coral Sol is an NGO on a mission to rescue and help endangered reefs recover, particularly in the Mediterranean and Atlantic Oceans. Sadly, these are some of the most endangered reefs on the planet. The biggest threats are pollution and climate change.
30 to 50 metres below this boat, a once thriving coral reef is in recovery. Coral Sol has removed over 2 tons of rubbish and discarded fishing gear and created 3 new coral nurseries. So is it working? Time for a deep dive. On the Punta de Mona reef wall, Marina points out recovered orange cup corals, and deeper down, these candelabra corals flourish once more. Some of these species grow only a centimetre a year, and decades of life can be destroyed in seconds by bottom trawling or an anchor. Deeper down, we reach the nurseries, and the team goes to work at the Coral Hospital. This pioneering project, developed in conjunction with French NGO Coral Guardian, has a 91% survival rate for coral, and the fish population has tripled. Globally, however, reefs are suffering.
The global picture for coral reefs is unfortunately not good at the moment. We're seeing, particularly in the last year, we had unprecedented heat in the ocean, as you know, and we saw huge coral bleaching and major mortality. We've lost, on average, about 1/3 of all coral reefs that existed since about the 1950s.
Marina says giving up is not an option.
We can't lose hope. There are great scientists and so many people working in marine recovery and conservation. We have to hold on to hope, because it's what gives us the strength to go on dedicating our lives to saving the coral.
Coral Sol is doing great work here in the south of Spain, but to save the world's coral, every single one of us needs to be on board. Ken Brown, CGTN, Granada.
Athletics has become the first sport to offer prize money to Olympic champions in a move that breaks with 128 years of Olympic tradition. Track and field gold medalists at this summer's Paris Games will receive $50,000. World Athletics President Sebastian Coe says it's a pivotal move. The International Olympic Committee previously argued that to compete at the Games is reward enough. Philip Barker is editor of the Journal of Olympic History.
It's something that's going to polarise the Olympic world, not because the Olympics are amateur anymore, as they once were, but because the positioning of the Olympic Games is always that they're so much more than just a sporting event. There's something above that level, something really, really special. But it doesn't come as any surprise that athletics should lead the way, because back in the 1990s, athletics were the first to give prize money for their world championships. In fact, in 1993 in Stuttgart, the prize wasn't so much money, but a car, because Mercedes were sponsoring the championship, and each winner got a car that was valued at around $28,000. So there's a little bit of history there. They brought in cash prizes in 1997 and also incentives for breaking a world record as well. So there's that extra level. But for these games, as we understand it, the prizes will only be given for gold medals, though there is a suggestion that in 2028 for Los Angeles, prize money will be given for gold, silver and bronze in the sport of athletics.
So, Philip, you talked about the Olympics being special, and of course we haven't seen prize money offered till now. How does this announcement change the Games and perhaps the Olympic spirit?
It does. I mean, if you go back to the early times, the modern Olympics revived in 1896, and I've got an old report somewhere. It's got pages and pages of amateur regulations, because the old men who organised the Olympics in those days, and they were exclusively men, set great store by being a gentleman amateur in the Olympics. And they were even very uneasy about people competing against others who were professionals from another sport. And there were people who were actually excluded from the Olympics because if they were a cricketer and played professionally as a cricketer, they couldn't compete as a footballer in the amateur Olympics. So much, much stricter in those days. In fact, Paavo Nurmi, the most successful athlete with 9 gold medals in the 1920s, was actually banned from the 1932 Olympics because he was deemed to be a professional. So it shows just how the International Federation has changed since then.
So if we see athletics perhaps leading the way, paying competitors, how much will other sports be compelled to follow suit?
It all depends. I mean, there is the IOC they give a tranche of their income after each Olympics to each international federation that administers an Olympic sport. They don't actually release any details as to who gets the most, but it's thought that athletics, gymnastics and aquatics, that's to say swimming and diving, which are pretty much dominant sports in terms of television coverage at any given Olympics, they get the lion's share, and then there's a sort of pecking order for other sports. But certainly once you get down to the bottom, although it's still a very healthy income, it's said that getting on for half of the Olympic sports are dependent on their income from the IOC. So whether they would actually have the wherewithal to pay their athletes in this fashion is entirely another question.
The headlines again. Consumer prices in the United States increased more than expected in March, leaving another question mark over when the Federal Reserve will start cutting interest rates.
Concerns grow that China's battery capacity is running low and will not meet storage needs in the future.
And Israel says it's agreed the return of Palestinians to the north of Gaza as part of ceasefire talks being held in Egypt.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.